Hi guys, Olive here today to talk to you about the books I read in August 2020. During the month of August, I read what will probably become my favorite nonfiction book of the entire year, but I also read what will probably be one of my least favorite fiction books of the entire year. So let's get into it. So much of what I read this month were memoirs, or at least books with elements of memoirs in them. So I think we'll start with those. The first one that I read was a book called Being Lolita by Alison Wood. This is the memoir of a young woman who, as a teenager in the early 2000s, got into a romantic relationship with an English teacher at her high school. Now that she's an adult and sat down to write this memoir, she's able to see that entire situation for what it was. At the time, she thought it was a great love story, but now she's able to see that it was abuse. Specifically, just to start with, an abuse of power. They continued their relationship after she graduated from high school, and it was so unhealthy. This entire thing was really difficult to read, but the whole time I was really glad that she was telling her story. I'm glad that she has an outlet to tell her story. And I think it's really important to put out there because these types of love stories aren't love stories. They are stories of abuse. But at the same time, I really didn't like the execution of her storytelling in this book. She would be giving us her perspective from when she was in high school. I mean, she's telling us the story of how she got involved with this teacher. So she'd be giving us the perspective of a high schooler. And then she would jump in with her adult thoughts, like casting some doubt on the thoughts she had in high school, like discrediting them with what she knows now, which okay, I understand the impulse to do that, but I don't think she understood how much it interrupted the narrative. I think it's critical for us as the reader to really understand where she was at in her high school years, because I think most of the audience for this book are going to be adults like myself. And we're no longer in the teenage mindset. We have long since outgrown that. So you need to take us back to that spot and understand how caught up you were in this guy, how much you were believing all the lines he was feeding you, and to jump in with your adult thoughts really breaks that. Those moments really pulled me out of the story, as did the moments when she addressed the reader as reader, which I like in Jane Eyre and basically nowhere else. Along those same lines, there are a lot of literary allusions in this book. For too many, if you ask me. Obviously, there's Lolita. It's in the title of this book, and it was this English teacher's favorite book. I feel like that should be on a list of warning signs about dudes. If he says his favorite novel is Lolita, run. But not only does this author discuss Lolita in depth in this book, she essentially studies it and spoils it, I should note, but she also talks about Alice in Wonderland, the work of Edgar Allan Poe, The Great Gatsby. She makes Disney references. I get all of these things might have been a part of her world at the time. She might have discussed these things with the English teacher. But at the end of the day, you are telling a story, even if it is your own story, and you have the capability to include certain elements and leave other things out. And if certain elements, like all of these references, have the capacity to muddle your message as opposed to contribute something to what you're trying to communicate, then they should be left out. If you liked My Dark Vanessa, which I know is a novel with this kind of a story, I've actually heard that that one's a novelization of the author's own experience. Or you think it's important to read stories like these as kind of cautionary tales, then this might be worth your time, but this was a firm 3-star read for me. A much, much better memoir that I read during the month of August was actually a new August release. It was called Inferno by Catherine Cho. This is the author's story of developing postpartum psychosis. She had a really unusual presentation of it. Typically, it develops right after you give birth, but with her, it didn't develop until nearly 3 months after she gave birth. But in her case, it was stress-induced. She started hearing voices, having hallucinations, and she generally had a break with reality. But in this book, she doesn't just talk about her time spent in the mental hospital being treated for this. That's definitely an element of this memoir, but that's not all of it. She goes the whole way back to her childhood. She talks about growing up in a Korean-American family in Virginia. She talks about escaping an abusive relationship that she moved to Hong Kong to pursue. Then she eventually does talk about meeting her husband and getting pregnant with her son. This all leads up to the point that we as readers know is coming, where she starts to develop these symptoms Her baby son's eyes started looking like the devil's eyes to her. She became convinced, and I mean truly convinced, that she was bouncing around between alternate realities. The way she describes what happened to her when she had this break, what all she was seeing, feeling, and experiencing, is truly haunting. I know that word is so overused. I know it's slapped on every hyped up publisher blurb, and most of the time it's not true. But in this case it is. That section is downright terrifying. I had no idea that horror and memoir could intersect, but they do in this case. And yet at the same time, this book is so beautiful. I don't know how she did this. This is her first book. I found it to be so impressive. It's definitely memorable. I think it's still giving me nightmares, but I highly recommend it. Another memoir I read during the month of August was Molly's Game by Molly Bloom. This is the story of how Molly Bloom stumbled into running the most exclusive and high-stakes poker game in LA that hosted both celebrities and business bigwigs. She was very successful during her time running the game until she eventually got arrested and had her accounts drained by the feds. I talked about this memoir and its really spectacular movie adaptation that's written and directed by Aaron Sorkin in a book versus movie video that I did. I will link that video for you up in the cards and down in the description box below in case you'd like to watch it. Another really great memoir I read this month was The Smallest Lights in the Universe by Sarah Seeger. This was written by a planetary scientist who has spent her entire career looking for Earth-like exoplanets in the hopes of finding life out there in the universe. She's a big name in her field. She teaches at MIT. She was awarded the coveted MacArthur Genius Grant in 2013. She obviously has a brilliant mind, but in this memoir, we get to see the woman behind the science. She tells her whole life story in this book, but she does focus on her adult years. She talks about losing her father, and then she eventually talks about the long and extremely painful process of losing her husband to cancer, after which she became a single mother to her 2 sons. The whole time she's telling us about her personal life, she is simultaneously telling us about the advances in her career, how she has struggled to get people at times to take her pursuit of finding the Earth's twin seriously. She's talked about how competitive that field can be, how cutthroat, and also how demanding it is to take on this kind of work when you are simultaneously trying to be a mother, especially one who's just lost her husband. There is so much about the grief process in this book, but there is also, at the same time, so much cool science. I really liked how she drew connections between what was going on in her life at the time and then what she was experiencing at work and the things she was discovering. I do think she could have drawn the lines between those two things a little bit thicker, made them a little bit more explicit for the audience. The way it is right now, it's very subtle. I think those connections are very good, very important, very interesting, but I think they could have been drawn out a little bit more so that more people will notice what she's trying to do there. But beyond that small gripe, I thought this was great. It's definitely a very moving memoir. Then I read 2 nature, or at least nature-ish books that had some memoir elements to them. The first was Fathoms by Rebecca Giggs. This is a book that's ostensibly all about whales, but in execution it goes far beyond that since it looks at so many sides of the connection between the human world and the animal world. And the second was Why Fish Don't Exist by Lulu Miller. This book is a little bit H's for Hawk-esque in the fact that several different things are going on at once in this book and somehow everything works really well together. It is part taxonomy, part biography, and part memoir. It sounds so odd, but I found it to be incredible, and I highly suspect it's going to be my favorite nonfiction book of the year. I reviewed both of these books in a video I did recently. I am actually particularly proud of that video. I really like how it turned out. So if you'd like to hear more about one or both of these books, I will link that for you in the cards and in the description box below. But a nature book that just didn't end up doing it for me this month was The Dragon Behind the Glass by Emily Voigt. I am so surprised I didn't love this one since the topic is that nature plus underground activity combination that I seem to love so much. And it's not even like this book made me angry. I just found it to be so underwhelming. The book starts off when the author is tagging along with a detective in New York City, seizing exotic pets from their owners, animals that they're not legally allowed to have. And this is how she ends up finding out about the arowana, or the dragonfish, which is a coveted fish in Asia because people think that owning one brings good luck. Breeding and selling them is therefore a very lucrative trade, even though they are all but extinct in the wild. And some of these fish are so valuable, some of the colors of fish are so valuable, that people are willing to commit some very serious crimes to get their hands on them. The book had me through that point. I thought it was all extremely interesting. But then in the latter half of the book, things start to get weird. The author decides she wants to track down an arowana in the wilds. Why? And then she also decides that she wants to chase down a potentially new species. It was just a mess by that point. The fish no longer had the starring role, and she had turned this story into an international adventure story, but a boring one. It was just a really underwhelming read. Next, I read The Twilight of Democracy by Anne Applebaum, who is the author of Red Famine and Gulag, amongst other books. She is also married to a Polish politician and has been since the early 90s. So she begins the entire book with an anecdote about how she and a group of friends and acquaintances rang in the new millennium together, rang in the year 2000 as a group. But now, because of how divided we all are, a lot of the people who were there for that party, she no longer speaks to anymore. And that very much sets the tone for this book, which I took to be a look into how we got to this state of division within global politics. She does focus on Europe in this book, since that's the region she knows best, even though she is an American. This was really more of a long essay than it was a formal book, but I still found it really interesting. It definitely made things clearer for me. No less terrifying, but definitely more understandable. I thought the parts about social media and how misinformation spreads were particularly important. I think Anne Applebaum is fantastic. I always feel really weird saying I like her books considering what she writes about. So as much as you can like this kind of thing, I liked it. I thought it made for very valuable reading. I don't think the title is entirely fitting, and I'm assuming the price tag isn't either considering how short it is, but I would say it's worth your time. I also read Wonder Girl by Dawn Van Natta Jr., which is a sports biography all about Mildred Babe Diedrichson Zaharias, who is definitely not the most famous babe to ever grace sports, but who can probably be considered one of the greatest female athletes of all time. Not only was she good at basically every sport she decided to take on, but she was also a very brash, cocky, theatrical type of person. If you would like to hear more about Babe, I did a whole review of this book that I will link for you in the cards and down in the description box below. I also read two more sports biographies, Little Wonder, all about Lottie Dodd, and The Divine Miss Marble, all about Alice Marble. I reviewed both of these for the Christian Science Monitor. I liked Little Wonder, but I loved The Divine Miss Marble. If you'd like to hear more about one or both of these books, I will put a link to that review in the description box below. Okay, I've been putting this moment off because this next book makes me so angry. I tend to be a pretty laid-back person, but once or twice a year, there is a book that just makes my blood boil. Last year it was The Secrets We Kept by Laura Prescott, and this year it's Migrations by Charlotte McConaughey. This book is all about a woman, Franny, who is trying her best to get aboard a fishing vessel so that she can follow the last known flock of Arctic terns on their final migration. She's an ornithologist, but she's traveling alone. She doesn't have a team with her. Her husband's not with her. And she eventually does convince a captain to take her on. We're told that this is a world that has changed, possibly one in our own future where there's basically no wildlife left. The oceans are empty. The savannas no longer have apex predators. The forests have been cleared, all because of the insatiable hunger of humans. Before I say anything else, let me just admit that that's a really interesting concept. I don't think all the elements of that are that far-fetched. I think we might be headed that way if we humans don't change our behavior. The fact that it's set in a dystopian world like that is the reason why this book is being compared to books like Station 11. But before I even truly start to go in on this book, let me assure you that that comparison is a flat-out lie, because there is no world building done in this book if it doesn't directly affect the main character. Does this author have any idea what that kind of die-off would mean for the Earth? She must not, because there are no conversations about what the world is like now. I have some questions about this world that she's created but not actually told us anything about. What do global temperatures look like? How are sea levels doing? Have people moved north? How are crops being cultivated? How are people getting by? The author chooses to comment upon none of that because she is far too busy showing this character being tortured by her own mind and her own self-delusions. This is a character who sleepwalks, knows about it, knows that she behaves recklessly and causes harm when she does so, but does she do anything about it? Of course not. This whole book is nothing but an exercise in emotional manipulation, and this world that the author created is nothing but a very boring vehicle to tell the story of a character who's tortured and just wants to be free. The ending is a load of crap as well, and this book is just hot, or should I say, globally warmed garbage. The romance book I took on this month, The Boyfriend Project by Farah Rochan, didn't really impress me either. It was not a balm on my wounds whatsoever. I really did like the beginning of this book when our main character and two other women confront this guy that they had all unknowingly been dating at the same time at a restaurant. Someone catches it on camera and that video goes viral, bringing them all fame they never asked for. The upside to this situation is that these three women bond over the experience and become friends. They make a vow to one another that they're going to take a break from dating so that they can focus on their goals and their side projects. But that all goes out the window when a new guy starts at our main character's workplace. And that was pretty much my problem with this book. Why even have a pact like that be a part of the storyline if the main character isn't even going to make an attempt to stick to it? She throws it out immediately. She doesn't even try. So that, plus the insta-love that was going on, had me pretty mentally checked out from this book from very early on. In the month of August, I also reread The Odyssey by Homer, which I had not read since high school. I did my latest What's the Story Wishbone video on the episode that takes on The Odyssey. It was a very unconventional episode of Wishbone that I somehow found to still be very effective. If you'd like to hear why and see snippets of the episode in that video, I will link it for you in the cards and in the description box below. But the main reason that I wanted to reread The Odyssey this month was to brush up on some of the details of the story so that I could pick up two related works. One of those was Cersei by Madeline Miller. This is an extremely popular book, to say the least, that gives Cersei, a witch within Greek mythology, a chance to tell her own story. I thought this was fantastic. I thought the way the character of Cersei developed throughout the book was so interesting. I thought it was paced beautifully, and I thought all of the characters, not just Cersei, were extremely nuanced and complex. She managed to take Greek mythology and make it her own. She took these extremely famous figures and made it so that we were meeting them for the first time, even though we already knew who they were. I thought it was all extremely impressive. Unfortunately, I had the opposite reaction to my other Odyssey-related pick. I thought the Penelope ad by Margaret Atwood was a complete dud. This book is extremely short, and I still couldn't finish it. I had to DNF it. This book feels like it was written for high schoolers. That is not me being facetious. It is so simplistic in its language, and it's about as subtle as a sledgehammer. It's supposed to be Penelope's story of what all she did while Odysseus was away for all of that time on his Odyssey. But instead, it's her looking back at her life after her death, so she's dead when she's telling this story. And it's really cynical and really aggressive. Not to say that she doesn't have the right to feel that way, but it just didn't feel like Penelope. There was more that I disliked about this book, but after all of that venting I did about migrations earlier, I don't know that I have it in me to go into it. I wrote about it on Goodreads if you want to check that out. But I'll just add that I think if you took Margaret Atwood's name off of this book, it would have a lot lower of an average rating on Goodreads, if you catch my drift. So that was my reading month for August. The highest of highs and the lowest of lows. I think I need an ibuprofen. If you've read any of these books, if you've heard of any of these books, or if you would like to read them after hearing me discuss them, please feel free to let me know in the comment section below. But if you would like to connect with me somewhere other than YouTube, I am on a variety of different places on social media, and the links to all of my profiles will be in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.